Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about Todd Gitlin's book, The Sixties, Years of Hope, Days of Rage. And Todd Gitlin was the president of the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, during the early 1960s. So definitely has a very interesting perspective from the 1960s, definitely a perspective worth reading and hearing about. But this book is definitely more memoir focused. It's a story in the history of the 1960s, but it's definitely told from the point of view of his own experiences, and it really focuses on the New Left and the SDS. And it's a book that I've read once before, at least started to read once before. It's been on my bookshelf for about, I would say, 7 or 8 years. And when I first picked it up, I got about a third of the way through, got bored, and put it down, because it was really going into a lot of detail about the SDS and the New Left. I really didn't have much interest in reading about it back then, but this time around I'm really focusing on studying 1960s and learning as much as I can about the 60s. So it's definitely interesting to hear about the New Left's development and the SDS during this time period. So it was a bit rambling, like I said, in certain parts we went on and on and on about a lot of very specific things, but definitely I'm glad I read it. Definitely have some mixed feelings about it, which I'll get into in this video. But I like the way that he sets up the 1960s. He does a good job describing what was at stake in the early 1960s and how that led to the rest of the decade playing out as it did. But when he describes 1950s, I like the way that he describes it. He describes the 50s as there being many 1950s. There wasn't just one 1950s, because everyone thinks of this image of this suburban utopia during the 1950s where everyone lived the same lifestyle, had a house, a car, a bunch of kids, a lawn and a white picket fence. That wasn't the case for everyone, because when you think of like African Americans during this time period, they definitely didn't live the same lifestyle as white middle class Americans living in Levittown during this time period. So it kind of dispels myth that everyone lived the same lifestyle during this time period. There were many different ways that people lived during the 1950s, but regardless of what group of people you were in during the 1950s, the 60s definitely shattered the 1950s. The 60s definitely shook up whatever way of life that you had. Once the 60s came around, it was very, very different for everyone. And the author, Todd Gitlin, he lived within this white suburban middle class America, so he definitely grew up in the American everyone thinks of during the 1950s, and he definitely does a really good job describing what that lifestyle was like, what it was like to grow up in that atmosphere of suburban America. But he definitely describes the 1950s as Americans had a sense of optimism. No matter what group you were in, even if you were African American or a white American, there definitely is a sense of optimism amongst all people, because the economic conditions of the whole country improved. No matter what group you were in, you were better off in the end of the 1950s than you were at the end of the 1940s. So across the board, conditions improved for everyone. Even though conditions improved more for some people had more opportunities than other people, everyone was in a better position by the end of the 1950s than they were before World War II. And despite there being the sense of optimism, he definitely describes that there were a lot of divisions that were emerging in America during this time period, despite that, especially amongst different generations. And to kind of paraphrase him here, I like the way he describes this division that was emerging, because he says that the older generation could never convey how they were haunted by the Depression and relieved by the affluence of the 1950s. And the youths of America during this time period could never convey to their parents how tired they were of being reminded of how bad things used to be and how grateful they should be for how good things were in the 1950s. You definitely see this division emerging during this time period where the two generations just really didn't understand each other, because the older generation, they went through this crisis period in America. They went through a depression, a war, and these young people grew up during one of the most affluent times in American history. So they definitely didn't understand each other, and that's really, I think, what was the root thing going on during the 1950s that set up the 1960s when the 1960s finally came about. And despite the 50s being a very affluent, a very prosperous time period, there definitely was a lack of fulfillment in people's lives during the 1950s. People definitely didn't feel very fulfilled, even though they were able to improve their economic conditions so much. But what the author kind of describes is that the reason for this, the reason people really never felt fulfilled, is that despite being a society that was very prosperous, they were a society that was very fearful. They were very haunted by the atomic bomb, haunted by the Holocaust, the memory of World War II. And a lot of things like the Vietnam War were the older generation's way of trying to prevent another world war, trying to prevent America sitting idly by while the rest of the world is overtaken by communism. So that's really was really a more driving force in people's lives than just economic prosperity. They definitely were very fearful. And along with all this fear that people felt during the 1950s, there was obviously this Cold War that was playing out. And there's a lot of fear of the Soviets overtaking the Americans in many different areas, especially in science and technology. And in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik. And with Sputnik, it kind of kicked off this space race. And there was a lot of fear of the Soviets overtaking Americans when it came to new technology. So there was this push for Americans to become more educated. There was a push for science and mathematics to be a much more prominent theme in the education of youth in America during this time period. So with all this happening in the 1950s, there's a lot of different factors colliding at the same time. Because with the older generation, having this affluence with this underlying fear of what was happening in this world, and this affluence led to a baby boom. So there was much more young people in America as the 1950s turned into the 1960s. And these young people were highly educated, yet disillusioned with everything that their parents had to say about how good they had and how grateful they should be. So these factors colliding is really what created the atmosphere that allowed the 1960s to play out. And after the author describes the conditions of America in the 1950s and early 1960s, he goes into the development of the new left. And the old left, which was a lot of the left-wing radicals of the 20s, 30s, 40s, they were wiped out by McCarthyism in the 1950s. And to survive, the left was forced to go underground. And in this underground world of the 1950s, this is what birthed both the new left and the counterculture. Both have their origins in this very underground scene, because America in the 1950s was forced to kind of restart, because this affluent period in the 1950s really birthed a brand new America, because the 1950s proved that capitalism worked. For better or worse, capitalism worked during the 1950s. Everyone became richer, companies profited. It was very hard to argue against capitalism during the 1950s. And all of the liberals during this time period were either forced to align with anti-communism, or they were rooted out as being communists. So the left was really destroyed, and everyone became basically at the same level. And the right developed as basically the status quo in the 1950s. So a brand new left had to emerge during this time period. And the left kind of collected around a lot of different artsy communities, a lot of writers, painters, and poets. This is where the left kind of survived during the 1950s. And this author describes the Beat Generation as being the ones that kicked open the door. They were kind of the spokespeople of this underground artsy society that thrived during the 1950s. Not all the Beats were left-wing. There was many different points of view amongst the Beat Generation, but they definitely were the voice of this underground world that birthed both the counterculture and the new left during this time period. And along with the Beat Generation kicking open the front door to this underground world, a lot of actors like James Dean and Marlon Brando definitely forced a lot of younger Americans to fall in love with this image of rebellion. And at the same time, folk music was having a revival. People like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were really singing about a lot of themes that were very prominent in this underground world during the 1950s. So this new left really emerged along with this developing underground culture that was emerging during the 1950s. And at the same time that all these things were happening in the late 1950s, early 1960s, along comes JFK. John F. Kennedy really gives people the sense of hope, really gives the left a sense of optimism that things could finally change. And JFK, in a sense, really passes the torch to the left. He passes the torch to a new generation. Because at this point, McCarthyism was starting to die out, and the civil rights movement was really revitalizing the left, giving people something to kind of collect around, something to believe in. And this is really where the left has this moment. It has this moment to kind of reinvent itself and pick up steam and kind of capitalize on the sense of hope and optimism that the Democratic Party has when JFK is president. And during this time period of optimism among the left, this is where the author Todd Gitlin really has his beginnings of involvement in the new left in America. And he was involved in this organization at his campus where he was in protesting the atomic bomb, protesting along with civil rights activists. And he really just started to get involved in politics. And the group that he was involved in didn't really have a central idea that was their main focus. They just kind of helped all different groups that were activists during this time period. And the thing that really changed what was going on was the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the group that he was in really didn't survive after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis was controversial amongst the left, because a lot of leftists were people who supported Fidel Castro. So Cuba was a very controversial thing to bring up amongst the new left during this time period. And the division that Cuban Missile Crisis caused amongst people in Todd's organization definitely really destroyed the group. And that was the case amongst a lot of different activist groups during this time period. And this is the point where Todd's focus begins to shift towards the SDS, because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was really the turning point for peace activists in America. This really was a turning point of Americans starting to see how insane the Cold War was, how insane this arms race was, and just really started to make Americans turn against the Cold War and what was happening in America during this time period. And as Todd shifts to the SDS was more focused on peace activism, which aligned with what was changing in America after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And after he discusses his shift in focus towards the SDS, talks about the Port Huron Statement. The Port Huron Statement was really the true birth of the New Left, because the SDS organized all these different groups amongst different leftist organizations came together to form this statement to kind of collectively decide what their focus was going to be as a new left. And it was interesting reading about all of the, fighting as they tried to write this text. Different groups wanted to have their input in what this document would say of what their focus was. It was just really interesting to read about. But after that, I feel like the book definitely starts to fall apart a little bit. It definitely becomes a little more rambling. It definitely just kind of goes on and on about different things that was happening in the SDS and just his own experiences during the 1960s. But what I will say, one thing I noticed in this book, he talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis and what was at stake with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then he talks about the Port Huron Statement and how that kind of established New Left. But the Port Huron Statement came about, I think it was about 6 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he definitely presents it almost as a Port Huron Statement coming, like it occurred after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really wasn't the case. And I think the reason he does this is because he really wants to show the reader what was at stake in the SDS's idealism, really show what they were fighting for. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is really the apex of the insanity of the arms race and what they were against. So he definitely sets up in a certain way to give the reader a certain image. I definitely agree with what he's trying to say, but it is sometimes a little frustrating seeing him kind of move things around for storytelling purposes when it's history. History happened a certain way. But I understand why he does it, but I think it's very important when you're reading things like this to really notice those things, to really ask yourself, why is the writer doing this? Why is he framing things a certain way? But I definitely would say this book is much more memoir-oriented, so it's a memoir, so he can kind of pick and choose when he chooses to talk about certain things. So yeah, it's definitely more memoir-oriented and history-oriented. So it's definitely one thing to keep in mind when you're reading this book. But it's all the truth. It's all what really happened. Just his framing and the order he tells things definitely helps to push a certain image to the reader. But after that, like I said, the book gets a little more rambling, a little more just memoir-oriented. But there are a couple things that I noticed that stood out to me, certain things that I learned and took away. I like the way that he describes the year 1964. He described 1964 as being the turning point of the 1960s. And you hear a lot about JFK assassination being the turning point in the 1960s quite a bit, but he chooses to focus on two other events that really set the stage for the decade. And the main event that he talks about is the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And at this convention, there was a lot of infighting amongst the different delegates because one of the southern states didn't allow any African American delegates to be at the convention, and that led to quite a bit of controversy. And as things played out at the convention, it really forced the Democratic Party to make a lot of compromises. And ultimately, all the compromises that were made amongst the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party was still very much the party of the South, the party of the old Democratic Party of the Confederacy. So it was still very much evolving into the modern Democratic Party that we have today. But ultimately, civil rights became a key focal point of the Democratic Party. After that convention, the Democrats were very focused on civil rights. So it really is this moment of realignment in the Democratic Party and in America as a whole. The 1964 is really a realignment period for both the Republicans and the Democrats. But this change to make the Democratic Party focus on civil rights was really them aligning closer to the New Left. So you see the New Left starting to inch its way into the Democratic Party more and more. And after this convention, it really sets the stage for what the Democratic Party is going to be. Really up until today, it really set the stage for what happens with the Democrats. And the other event in 1964 that he talks about as being a turning point is the Gulf and Tonkin incident, which today we know was much of it was fabricated by the U.S. military. They didn't really play out the way that they said it play out, but nonetheless, after that incident, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalated dramatically. That was really the point where the Vietnam War took off, and the Vietnam War is really the focal point of activism throughout the rest of the 1960s. So the author describes these two events, the Democratic Convention in 1964 and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, as being the two events that set up the 1960s. So after that happens, really, the 60s start to change, and everyone's very focused on civil rights and the Vietnam War, and really being involved in activism and just kind of protesting what was happening in America and throughout the world. And he points out in 1965, the artist Barry McGuire, his song "Eve of Destruction" was the #1 hit in America, and it climbed the charts much faster than any other rock song had done during this time period. And the Eve of Destruction really focuses on everything that was happening in America, focusing on this escalating Vietnam War and really just a protest song. And that really represents a changing landscape, that pop culture was starting to wake up to what was happening and becoming involved in protesting. So you see culture in America is starting to change. And this continues to change things as the 60s goes on. But he talks about the event in 1967, the Human Bee Inn in San Francisco, which was really what kick-started the Summer of Love in 1967. But this event in particular, he goes in a little bit of detail about it, but I kind of had my own reflections on it after reading it. But this is really the moment that the counterculture becomes a counterculture, really the event that represents that change. Because up until the early 1960s, there wasn't really a central counterculture movement. There were just many subcultures in America that were starting to slowly, have very similar focuses. And in the 1967 Human Bee Inn, it was called a gathering of tribes. So all these different groups came together to kind of cement their culture. In the way that the Port Huron Statement kind of cemented the New Left, the Human Bee Inn cemented the broader counterculture movement that was starting to emerge. Because you had the Beats, the hippies, the psychedelic culture, all these like new age seekers who were interested in Eastern philosophies, and the activists as well. So they all kind of came together at this event. And really, this represents forming of a true counterculture. The counterculture isn't just the hippies. The counterculture movement is a much broader movement that really was this counter narrative to the main culture of 1950s. And the Human Bee Inn also, I find interesting that it included the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels were really the security of this event, but the Hells Angels really also represent the counterculture, represent this rebellion in America. So it seems a little odd that the Human Bee Inn, with all these hippies and new age seekers, had the Hells Angels there. This violent group was part of that movement, but it really represents this broader counterculture, just this main counterculture, the counter narrative to what was happening in America. So after that moment, you really start to see the New Left and the counterculture start to converge more and more. There's different organizations like the Diggers and Abbie Hoffman with his Youth International Party known as the Yippies. So a lot of these organizations were very much blurring the lines between political activism and counterculture. So you start to see after the Human Bee Inn, things really changing. You see this broader counterculture movement emerge in America. And as the book goes on, he continues to talk about his involvement in the New Left and activism. But you definitely see as the 60s go on, he becomes much more disillusioned with the SDS, disillusioned with the New Left and what was happening in America. And he definitely starts to move away from what he was initially involved in the early 1960s. But I like how he describes that a lot of the activism and protests, especially amongst the Vietnam War, as time went on, became much more about solidarity with the Vietnamese, not so much about protesting America's war in Vietnam per se. It was just much more about taking the side of the North Vietnam, the Vietnamese. So you definitely see this shift in a lot of the protesting. And the event that really changes the 1960s again is the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was this moment where the Viet Cong had this massive attack against U.S. forces all across Vietnam. And the offensive was ultimately a failure for the Viet Cong. The Americans wiped out the Viet Cong after the Tet Offensive. They really weren't the same fighting force they were after that. But this event was ultimately a failure for the U.S. because it really brought the war into people's homes. These events that we're seeing in the news of this mass attack against U.S. forces and mass U.S. losses that initially when this attack first started really scared a lot of Americans and showed them that this war was not close to ending. This war was still going on, even though militarily the Tet Offensive was not a victory for the Viet Cong. It definitely it kind of was, because it made the home front much more distrustful of the U.S.'s role in Vietnam. It definitely really set the stage for America finally getting out of Vietnam, as the 60s went on and we moved into the 1970s. And after the Tet Offensive, there was much more of a sense of anger in America. People were much angrier, and the anti-war activism became much more violent. And after that, shortly after that, you saw Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated, you saw Bobby Kennedy assassinated. So things got much more violent after the Tet Offensive. People just were angrier and much more involved and much more vocal about what they believed. And then you saw events like the Chicago Democratic Convention, which was extremely violent, and at the Berkeley People's Park, where they formed this park in the city where they tried to kind of collect around all their counterculture ideas in this place, this peaceful gathering at this park. And then there was Bloody Thursday, where they cleared this park out, where they used guns, and people died and were injured as they cleared out all of these activists out of this park. So things were becoming much more violent, much more deadly. And then on top of that, the new left that Todd was a part of, at this point, moving away from, it branched off into this organization called the Weather Underground. And they did a lot of bombings and violent attacks, and there was the Days of Rage in Chicago. So things were just beginning to get more violent, beginning to fall apart. And he describes the Charles Manson murders, where Charles Manson and his followers killed several people. And he describes this as being very related to the Days of Rage, just related in the sense that the 60s was starting to fall apart. All of the activism and psychedelic culture and just the counterculture in general was starting to become more violent, and just really wasn't the same thing that it was when it first began in the mid-1960s. They had the Ultimate Free concert, which was really the Woodstock of the West, which was much more violent, and someone died at it, someone was stabbed. It just was a concert that kind of descended into chaos. So you really see the 60s starting to change, 1968, 1969, really after the Tet Offensive. That was really the moment where people became much more angry. And by the time Kent State happens in 1970, where protesters were shot at Kent State in Ohio, the anger had already been released. That was just really the final shot. I mean, that's the event people remember, with the 60s coming to an end and things getting more violent. But that was just the icing on the cake after all that had happened in 68 and 69. And Kent State was really just the final shot in things starting to unravel as the 60s came to an end. And the author makes very clear that the Vietnam War is really the centralizing force of all this protest and activism during the 1960s. And once the Vietnam War wasn't going on, the real spirit of the 1960s, the spirit of all this activism, started to die out. And he also describes that in the early 1970s, the baby boomers, who were the main people protesting the Vietnam War, they were all growing up. They were all starting their own families and really starting to move on from this rebellious time period of their early 20s. And a new generation was starting to be born. So things were just changing. The generation that was protesting in the 60s, they were starting to grow up and weren't protesting anymore. But I think the ultimate fate of counterculture, the new left during the 1960s, is it didn't really die out. It just kind of was absorbed by popular culture. and the counterculture became the mainstream culture by the 1970s. I think the main event that represents this transition from the counterculture becoming our main culture that we still live in now up until the age of Donald Trump, which is a whole other thing to talk about. But I think the event that really marks that transition is Watergate. Because after Watergate, which this book doesn't really talk about because that's obviously in the 1970s, but Watergate represents this moment of mistrust with the government where a lot of things that the New Left was protesting against kind of came to fruition, and people saw that maybe the government's a little corrupt, and a lot of the ideals of the New Left kind of became mainstream after Watergate. So Watergate is really, I think, the moment where the 60s really ends and the New Left is absorbed by popular culture in America. So yeah, this book is a dense book. It covers a lot of information, but despite the fact that it's so dense, it glosses over so much. Like, there's so much more it could have talked about. It could have made such better use of the number of pages that it has. I mean, it's almost 440 pages, so it's a very long book. So for such a long book, I would think it would be a much more detailed book in the events that it covers in the 1960s, but it glosses over a lot and focuses a lot on his own experiences with the STS and the New Left, which, I mean, that's the focus of the book. If you're reading this book to get a full picture of the entire 1960s, this may not be the book because it's very focused on the New Left. But if you want to read about the development of the New Left, this is definitely the book. It definitely has a lot of detail about that, but it's very memoir focused. It's not so much a history, even though it covers the whole history, some parts better than others. It's a memoir. It's focused on his own experiences. And like I said before, the book definitely rambles in a lot of parts. There's definitely a lot of parts where he goes on and on about things, and I think it wasn't a very well edited book. I think in some places he could say more by saying less, because a lot of times where he goes on and on about things, then it gets a little boring. He kind of loses the reader in some parts. I think it makes for a weaker book. But ultimately, I'm glad I read this book. It's definitely a book that you see, like I said before, shown again and again when you see books about the 60s. It's definitely worth reading, but I definitely was a little disappointed by this book. Even though I took some things away, definitely expanded my knowledge of the 60s, I definitely was a little disappointed after I finished reading this book. So yeah, that's the 60s. Years of Hope, Days of Rage. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.